Hey there, welcome back again to the Ivory Tower Collections, and yes, we finally have a new video for the new year. It's still January, so I guess I'm still okay at that point. So what's today's video going to focus on? Well, it has to do with something that I actually got yesterday, as a matter of fact, or actually I got it on Friday, so I've had some time to kind of play around with it, mess around with it, and really learn to understand how to use it. And it actually is designed for this bad boy right here. Yes, this is the Atari 7800, my specific 7800 in fact, here at the ITC. And one of the biggest things about this console, obviously as you know, it can do both 7800 and 2600 games, but up until recently there really haven't been any flash cartridges available for the 7800. But notice I said until recently. Well, there's actually two solutions on the market that are currently available, and the video today will focus on one of those solutions that I have gotten in. And it is in this box right here. In this box is basically the everything you can imagine kitchen sink flash cartridge. I am of course talking about the cartridge known as the Dragonfly. So here's how I received it. This is the box that it came in. And here's the cartridge. So let's take a look at the contents. So we have the cartridge itself, which I chose the purple type color. It is a 3D printed case. And it's going to be very hard for it to show up on camera, but it almost has a, it's got a really awesome textured look to it that almost simulates the texture from the 7800 case shell itself. And in certain types of light, it almost has a, almost like a silvery fleck appearance to it. But it's actually a very good complementing color to the 7800's color scheme. So yeah, this is the cartridge itself. We'll go into more detail on that in a bit. Set that off to the side. It also comes with a power adapter harness. Now, I'll get into more detail on that, but I'll set that here. And then I also have an additional power harness that came with mine as well to use in case I use a different type of power adapter on the 7800. I've done that in some upgrade work for clients where I've actually changed out the default power connection on the 7800 with something more universal like those used on Sega Genesis type systems. And that's what this power harness is for. But we won't need this for now, so I'm going to take that, put that off to the side. Let's get this out of the way. So here is the Dragonfly cartridge itself, and it is bigger and thicker than a normal Atari cartridge is. In fact, here's my copy of Commando as a comparison. It's upside down. I apologize for that. There we go. So it's a little bit wider on the edges. Now the actual portion that plugs into the console here is of course the same size so that it can fit in. And in actuality, I've tested this out, it seems to fit really nicely in consoles in 7800s, even the ones that are kind of tricky that don't like third-party games. It seems to fit just fine. Likely because of these tapered corners on the cartridge edges, as I can see here. So yeah, the Dragonfly cartridge, let's talk about it. Here we have it. It's got a nice little vinyl sticker type label that's been adhered to one side of it. This would be the side that would face out towards the back of the console, just like on a standard cartridge when it's plugged in. On one side of it here, we have two power ports and the actual on-off switch for it. Yes, the cartridge has its own individual on-off switch to toggle it on and off. The power ports are the main input power here that the Dragonfly uses to receive power in order to operate. Yes, it does require its own separate power supply. And it also has another port here specifically for providing power. It comes with a power harness like this with a 3D printed plug that you plug into the 7800. So basically the power supply you plug into this will provide a pass-through power through the cartridge to operate and back into the console itself, so that you still only need one power supply technically to operate it. Now, because of that, you're going to need a different kind of power supply than what you may have on hand for this. It actually uses the exact same size barrel jack as a Sega Genesis Model 1 or a Master System or even a Jaguar power supply. However, the polarity is reversed, so you'll have to get yourself a different power supply that basically meets the same specs but has a center tip positive on it. And I'll throw a little graphic or something up over here to kind of give you quick specs of what you'll need. But basically, any power supply that puts out 9 volts exactly. You don't want to use a power supply, an older transformer based one, because they actually put out almost 14 plus volts without a load, and the Dragonfly can only handle a 9 volt input load. So a more modern switching power supply would be required for this. I have some, and I'll even try to find some links to provide some for others that people have used with success. Then, on the other side of the Dragonfly here, we find a micro USB and the micro SD slot for the actual games. Yes, the games. The cartridge comes with a preloaded, in my case, 16 gigabyte SD card, or cartridge, or SD card, that's got basically every publicly released homebrew and demo, along with all of the original releases from back in the day, already preloaded and formulated into different directories to make it easy to navigate and find what you're looking for. The SD card is formatted as a FAT32 SD card. So, and I'll be honest, the 16 gigs that this came with is way more room than you will ever need on this, for sure. And then the micro USB port here is not for power, but it's for developers to be able to use to quickly send new game code to the cartridge if they wish for, again, developing games. So that's not a port that I'm going to likely use too much, but it's nice to have it. And then we have the main operations of the Dragonfly itself. This consists of a backlit OLED LCD screen. It's not color, it's basically like a monochrome type screen, but at the time of ordering one of these, you can get a choice of what colors you want as far as your text color and background. On my particular one, I'm actually using a blue against a white type background. And then we have these buttons here. These are the navigation buttons. Specifically, we have basically what he calls escape. I like to call it like the home button, because anytime you push this, it kind of goes back to where you were and eventually back to the main directory structure. You have your up and down buttons here, which are exactly what they kind of sound like. They allow you to scroll through different folders and different files. And then you have an actual enter or select button over here to the far right. So that's basically the Dragonfly in and of itself. So why don't I go ahead and I'll take this apart and we'll take a peek inside real quick. Be right back. I had mentioned it before, but the Dragonfly cartridge is actually comprised of multiple pieces that have been assembled. And it has basically 4 tiny little M.2 self-tapper screws along the sides that hold the entire case assembly together. So let me just kind of get these undone here. It actually holds itself together pretty good, even after you've got these little screws removed. So you can see I've got my little M.2s here. Or M2 screws, I say M.2, I guess I'm not talking about NVMe drives here. Alright, let me get those off to the side. And then here's the Dragonfly itself. So, I'm going to carefully take this apart. I'm going to start by sliding this lower piece down and out of the way a little bit. Just like that. So already we can see part of the guts on the inside of the Dragonfly. Now I'm going to lift the top cover off and out of the way. There we go. Now we can really see the bulk of the Dragonfly. And then I'm going to carefully remove the rest of it from the housing. There we go. There's the back cover. We'll get that out of the way. And then we have the front faceplate, which covers the LCD and the navigation buttons. And here we have the Dragonfly in all of its glory. But what exactly are we looking at? Well, the way the Dragonfly works, and keep in mind, I have extra modules that I purchased on mine to have added. Just so you can see, I have a PokeyMAX chip that's been installed, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a FPGA solution that replaces the original Pokey chips that were used in 5200s and some 7800 games and a lot of Atari arcade machines. And then I also have a Yamaha FM, what is this, a YM, I believe it's a 2151, that's also been added in as well for future support for games to be able to utilize FM audio synthesis. So the way that your Dragonfly basically worked, changing itself and reprogramming itself to mimic whatever game you have chosen to play. So as an example, if you're going to choose the game Commando, then it will load itself up utilizing the Pokey parameters and everything else that's necessary, and when the Atari is powered on, it will appear as a Commando cartridge. It will not actually know that it is this very sophisticated flash cartridge device. Another thing to show on the Dragonfly is, of course, the back side of it. You can see that there's different logos and what have you, but also, and this will be kind of hard to see, but I'll see if I can get the camera to zoom in. I am shooting this section in 4K, so right here we have these 3 tiny little surface mount trim pots, and these are to control the different volume levels for the different modules that have been added to the cartridge. The top one is for standard Pokey or for single channel Pokey. Notice I said single channel, or I said single Pokey. The second one is for dual Pokey, because if you have the PokeyMAX installed like I do, it can actually emulate 2 Pokey chips at the same time, providing you up to 8 additional or 8 total channels of audio utilizing Pokey synthesis. And then the bottom chip here, marked as the YM, is of course for the FM module. Now the reason why I'm showing you these is because on my particular 7800, when I powered this in the first time and was checking it out, I noticed that the Pokey audio from this particular cartridge was actually very loud compared to the rest of the TIA audio coming from my 7800 itself. This is actually an exact opposite problem to what we usually run into, which is where the Pokey isn't loud enough and sometimes has to be adjusted. So these potentiometers on the back are here so that you can adjust those volume levels and bring it more along in balance. I actually have the Pokey audio on this one turned all the way down to its lowest setting, and it's still just the tiniest bit louder than the TIA, but it's okay. Also, I found that the YM, or the FM audio, was a tad on the low side, so I ended up maxing that out almost to max. I found out if it's too loud or if it's maxed out too far, it could cause some distortion. So I actually have it down to, I'd say, probably about 90% of its full setting, and I'm pretty happy with that as well. So just showing you that so that if you have those issues as well, you know that there are potentiometers on the back to adjust it. I would recommend the use of a plastic adjustment tool when adjusting this, especially if you have something playing live so that you don't short anything out. So I have this little trim pot adjuster. It's actually called a trim pot adjuster. Made of plastic here. Where did I get this from? I don't know. KB Electronics. Got it from somewhere. But it's handy to use, and the flat tip side on this pretty much just about perfectly meshes in with those. And again, it appears to use what looks like an OLED LCD, a monochrome OLED, to show the pictures. We can also see on the sides here in more detail, we can see the SD reader. It is a spring-loaded reader, so that's nice. There's the micro USB port for development purposes, and then we have the 2 different power ports here, the main power input and the power pass-through ports here, in addition to the on-off switches. So yeah, very advanced, very cool piece of tech. Now I'm going to go ahead and put this all back together, and I'll show you how it operates. I now have the 7800 set up, and I have the Dragonfly cartridge plugged into place. And hopefully my focus will work properly for this. But first I want to show you how everything's connected up. So the Dragonfly is plugged straight into the 7800, and it actually fits in pretty darn flush. I'm sure you can see here that the larger portion of the cartridge meets up perfectly, pretty close to the edges of the system there. Also, I have the new power supply, replacement power supply, plugged into the top port of the Dragonfly here. And then I have the pass-through cable from the Dragonfly plugged into the standard power port on the 7800. So basically the way that this all works is, you got a little bit of, cable management you got to do here, I suppose, to get it up and running. But again, that's because there's so much going on with the Dragonfly cartridge. It's able to do so many different things that it requires its own separate power source in order to work properly. Okay, so we're zoomed in on the cartridge. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to power the cartridge on first. Now the way that this works is you first turn on the cartridge, which will light up its display. Hopefully my camera will be able to figure that out and compensate. And you will see that it says 7800, basically DF. I actually have this relabeled as DF cartridge. That's just the volume label I gave it on my particular 7800. And it says HB directory. Let me go back on, turn it back on. The display only stays lit for a little bit. There is an option, a configuration setting, which I'll go through in a little bit. But first, let's go through the basic operations. So this says that I'm in my homebrew directory. And then I also have a music directory, which has different Pokey audio. There's my work in progress directory that I created. There's a protos directory. And then a diagnostic. So basically, each folder, you can create folders on the main root that you name to make it easier to isolate or to organize your particular files. There's the YM2151 files, basically stuff that uses FM. Original directory is all of the original released games. And then we're back to the homebrew again. So as an example, let's go ahead and take a look at the original released games. Now I'm going to use the select key here on the far right hand side. And it starts with NTSC or PAL. Again, this came preloaded with basically all the ROMs on it. So obviously I'm going to choose NTSC in my particular case because that's what I have. And then here are all the NTSC games. And they're in alphabetical order initially. So that's going to be Ace of Aces. And then we're going to have, you know, that's like Alien Brigade. And there's a couple of different ones there. There's some Asteroids ROMs. Let's see, what was that? That was Ball Blazer, Barnyard Blaster, Basket Brawl, Centipede, etc. So the way it works is you just go and you find the game you want to play. So let's say, for instance, that I want to play Xevious, right? Once you have the game that you want, you hit the select button. It will sit there and it'll show you the name of the file and it will say that it's loading. And then it asks you and tells you to turn on the console. So at that point, you would do exactly that. You would go ahead and hit the power button on the console. At that point, it will then show you what the name of the game is and shows what video format. In this particular case, it says I'm playing Xevious and it's an NTSC, and the game would load up and you would be able to play as normal. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and power off the console at this point if you want to load a different game. But because the Dragonfly cartridge is essentially controlling the power to the 7800, I could go ahead and choose another game. So let's say, for instance, I decide I want to play looks like I went back a folder there. Let's say instead I want to go ahead and play, I don't know, let's say I want to play Basket Brawl. Well, I can go ahead and hit the load button to select it. It'll start loading the game, and as soon as I did that, it also powers off the Atari 7800. I don't know how well that will show up on the camera, and I apologize. Maybe I should scoot this back a little bit so that we can see a little bit more of my console. Anyway, so now it's asking me to turn the console on, so I go ahead and I power on the console. You can see my power light glowing there in the lower portion of the camera file. And that shows that we would be playing Basket Brawl. So again, if I wanted to choose a different game, I can just hit the home button, which takes me back to the file selection, and I can choose something else. So let's say instead I want to play Commando. I'm going to go ahead and hit the load button, the select button. It starts loading it. It powered off the console. And then when everything is ready to go, it says turn it on to load, or turn on the console. And then it would load it up, and it shows the name of the game, and the game plays as normal. So very cool. So what I want to talk about now is I want to show you some alternate modes that are available on the Dragonfly cartridge when you initially power it on. So if you hold down both of the up and down buttons in the center as you turn on the Dragonfly, this will put the Dragonfly into its configuration setup options. Now you'll notice right now it says Setup Pokey. We also have options for Dual Pokey, Covox, the Yamaha 2151 chip module, extra external RAM, the serial number, which is literally that. It shows you the serial number of your cartridge. And then there's also LCD adjustments. Plus you can select if you want it to display the name of the game or not, the software version, information, and RS-232 setup, which is used with the USB port on the side. And then you can put the cartridge into actual developer mode. And back to Pokey. So what are some of the options? Well, for most people, you might mess around with these. So I'll start with the Pokey first. Again, I'm going to use my select key. And it's going to ask you which Pokey do you have. Well, I do have the PokeyMAX chip installed, as we saw. But you can also specify if you have an original Pokey chip, because that will change some of the options that are available to you, of course, through the Dragonfly. You can also state that you don't have a Pokey installed. So this would prevent, obviously, any games that use the Pokey from trying to use it because it's not present. I'm going to leave mine on the PokeyMAX. That takes us to dual Pokey. So what is that all about? Well, you only have the dual Pokey available. If you have the PokeyMAX FPGA installed, it can actually simulate 2 Pokey chips. And then again, would provide you from the usual 4 to actually 8 additional total voices of audio. So it's just like before. You specify if you have it in place or not. You can say it's not installed or it is installed. Then we have the Covox. Now I don't have any files that use the Covox yet, but again, the PokeyMAX can simulate the Covox speech thing as an additional digital to audio or digital to analog converter for digital audio on computers back in the day. It actually utilized the parallel port in most cases. So it is possible to turn the PokeyMAX into a Covox speech thing and enable that or disable that as well. Then we have the Yamaha 2151, and just like the other options, you can say that whether or not you have the module installed or not. We have the system RAM. Now I will state that there are options on this, and let's talk about the external RAM. So some games utilized external RAM, and there's also a thing called the external RAM cartridge. Some games utilized it, needed it, and for the most part, the Dragonfly should be able to provide that as needed for those games. But at least in the case of the Pac-Man Collection for the XM module, it requires that you set the extra or the external RAM option to be forced, to always be active and on. Your options are to enable it, disable it, and force. I have it set to forced so that it's always present and it always is available to whatever games might want it. I'm not going to go through the serial number, but basically it just shows you, like I said, the serial number of your cartridge. There's the LCD adjustment. Now specifically on this, you can tell it whether or not you want it to automatically turn off or if you want it to always remain on. I have mine set to automatically turn off. You can also adjust your contrast settings. So I have mine currently set to 8. But you will see that as I drop it down, we're down to 5. There's, what is that? That's 4. That would be 3, 2, 1. And then we have max contrast. Now I have found that really any contrast setting above 8 doesn't really change a whole lot. 8's where I happen to keep mine because I can read that just fine. But yeah, it goes all the way up to 30. But really anything past 8 or really past 10, you're just not going to really notice too much. The name display. So the option on this is whether or not you want it to show the name of the game on the display as you're playing. And one of the advantages of having that is obviously so you know what the game is that you're playing, but the other thing is that it can actually save load up times if you disable this option, because if that's not something you really care about, you can see the file name, you know what the game is, you hit it, you load it, and you're just going to play it and you're not going to pay attention to the screen after that, then you can actually set this to disable this option, and again, it saves a little bit of time on load up. Software version. So this is exactly what it sounds like. If there's new firmware updates available and you want to see what version you're currently running, you go here to the software version to see which firmware you have. I currently have 1.04, which at the time of this video was the latest. Actually, my Dragonfly cartridge arrived with this firmware already preloaded. And then RS-232 setup again, this just goes through different options such as your baud rate, settings, pretty much that's about it. And again, that's primarily for use with the developer's use and the USB port. So that's pretty much most of the setup that most people are going to care about, and that's basically how the Dragonfly works. So yeah, that's pretty much the Dragonfly cartridge. So are there any negatives to this? It seems to have a really lot of cool features it can do, but are there any negatives? Well, there are a few things to be aware of, or some caveats. Probably the first concern I have actually has to do with the screws, the self-tappers that are used on here. While they appear to hold all of the different pieces together easily enough for now, I can see these easily stripping out the plastic if you have to disassemble the cartridge more than a few times. It would be nice if they were a little bit longer and perhaps a tiny bit bigger, but maybe there's physical constraints as to why he couldn't use larger screws. The other issue I have is actually the label itself. I don't have a problem with the design or the type of the quality of the material that's been used. The problem I have is that mine actually arrived already starting to peel from off of this plastic on the edges here. And I've had to consistently, as I pop it in, just kind of press down on it periodically. I assume at some point, if I haven't used it for a while, I'll probably come to it and find it curled up quite a bit and I'll have to apply some adhesive. So it might be good in the future for future print runs if it's possible to make this one. I haven't lifted up the sticker to see, but I assume it's textured just like the rest of the cartridges. It might be better if this was made flat on this side so that the cartridge could adhere to it better. It might be flat for all I know. But based on what little bit of evidence I can see on the label, I think it's probably textured as well. Let's see, any other issues that I've had with this? The navigation buttons. So for the most part, I don't have any issues with these buttons, but there have been a few times where I have pushed the buttons and it didn't act like it actually engaged, and I'd have to push the button a second time. That mainly seems to happen on my up and down buttons, but maybe that's just my particular cartridge. It's not a deal breaker by any means, because I can usually push the button again and it seems to work just fine. The other thing to be aware of is actually in its power pass-through setup. So for the most part, for a standard 7800, this is going to work fine and it's never going to have any issues for you and you'll be good to go. However, on certain consoles that have been modified with other power solutions, for instance, some of the services that I've offered to my own clients, I actually have DC to DC voltage regulators installed in place of the old linear regulators. This is mainly to increase efficiency of the entire 7800 so that it doesn't draw near as much current from its power supply as it normally would. It also completely eliminates the heat that's generated by that voltage regulator behind the cartridge port. However, some of the earlier voltage regulators that I was using, and some of the more commonly used ones that I've seen people use, actually might require more than 9 volts to kick in. A lot of those voltage DC-DC regulators have a dual use mode or a dual voltage output. They normally provide 5 volts, but then they can also provide 3.3 volts. And what determines that is basically the input voltage that you supply to it. So I've had some that I've done some testing with, and if they have less than like maybe 11 to 12 volts being applied to them, they actually kick into their 3 volt mode, and as a result, the 7800 doesn't power on properly. However, because the Dragonfly can only take a 9 volt input source, you can see that if you have one of those DC-DC regulators, it could cause issues in that the Dragonfly will work properly, but your 7800 won't, because the 9 volts coming from the Dragonfly doesn't have enough voltage to actually engage the DC-DC regulator you have installed. There's a workaround, and it simply consists of not using the power pass-through, and instead just power your 7800 normally from its own internal power supply, and make sure you have the power supply for the Dragonfly. This way you can use the Dragonfly, you load the game as normal, and when it says to turn on the console, you just physically turn on the console and you're good to go. Another more permanent fix, if you prefer the single power supply solution that still works with the Dragonfly and your console, is to make sure that if you do have a DC-DC regulator installed, or if you plan to install one, make sure that you have one that can be turned on or can use as low as 7 volts input to engage its 5 volt output mode. That way the 9 volts coming from the Dragonfly is enough voltage to switch on the DC-DC regulator and allow it to do its job. So it would be good if there was some way, if the actual display on the file names, because it's limited to the 8.3 format, and it also will interpret special characters in different ways, it would be nice if that could somehow be extended to maybe scroll across or something. So yeah, with that, that's pretty much all I have to describe or to talk about on the Dragonfly. I think it's a really awesome cartridge. It's not the cheapest thing, you know, but it's comparable to other flash cartridges in its default configuration if you receive it. It only starts to get really pricey when you add the PokeyMAX and the FM module to it, but I'm glad to have those options just for future games and development that might support them and use them, and they're pretty cool. So with that, I will end this video with a couple of clips captured from my 7800 using the Dragonfly cartridge of some recent homebrews and some of the cool features. So thanks again for hanging out with me today at the Ivory Tower Collections, and I will catch you guys next time. Thanks.